Okay, so now let us look at our first question over here. Yes, but before we begin looking at these questions, there's something that I want to mention. Yes, so whenever we are completing the square, we have to make sure that the leading coefficient is 1. All right. Okay, with that in mind, let us then get into looking at our first question. Yes, and if we look at our first question over here, it has a leading coefficient of what? Of 1, right? And what are we supposed to do? We have to find a number that we have to add and subtract so we can what? Create a perfect square trinomial while keeping the value of the expression. Yes? Okay, so let's do that. And how do we find that number? We just have to take half the coefficient of x and then square it. And the coefficient of x in our quadratic expression over here is 10. Then we take the half and then square it, right? 2 into 10, that gives us 5. 5 by 5 is 25. So we now know that this is the number that we have to add and subtract, right? Okay, so let's do that. So then that would be x squared plus 10x. We're adding a 25 plus 25, subtracting a 25, then plus 4. Yes? Okay, so now let us simplify. If we look at this expression over here, that's a perfect square trinomial, right? So we can factorize that into what? Squared binomial, right? Okay, and what would that look like? That would be, what's the square root of x squared? X. And then how do we find the constant that we have to put in the bracket? Remember, we have to what? To take the half of the coefficient of what? Of x. All right? And what is the coefficient of x in our question over here? It's what? It's 10, right? Okay, so let's write it here. The coefficient of x is positive 10, so we're taking the half. What will that give us? That will give us 5. Positive 5, right? So it's positive 5 that we have to add in our what? In our brackets over here. So that will be positive 5. Let me just write that properly. Positive 5, and then we square it, right? Okay, so now let us deal with our remaining two terms over here, right? Negative 25 plus 4, that gives us what? Negative what? Negative 21. So there we go. We have what? Completed the square. And if we look at our solution over here, it's in this completed square form right here, yes? With a leading coefficient of 1. Yeah? Okay, so now let us look at question number 2. And if you look at question number 2, it also has a leading coefficient of 1, right? And what's the first thing that we have to do? We look for a number that we can add and subtract so we can create a perfect square trinomial while keeping the value of the expression, right? And how do we do that? We take the half of the what? X coefficient and then square it. And in our case, our half is what? Our x coefficient. Yes, our x coefficient is negative 12. So we take the half and then we square it. 2 into negative 12, that's negative 6. Square it. Negative 6 by negative 6, that's what? 36. Yes? Okay. Now this is the number that we were supposed to add, right? And subtract. So then we shall have x squared minus 12x. We're adding the 36 plus 36 minus 36 plus 5. Yes? Okay, so now let us simplify. This expression right here is a perfect square trinomial. So we can factorize that into what? Squared binomial, right? Okay. And how do we do that? We open our brackets. What's the square root of x squared? X. Yes. And to get the constant that we have to put in our bracket over here, remember we have to what? To take the half of the what? Coefficient of x. So that's negative 12. Yes, our coefficient of x is negative 12. So 2 into negative 12 is what? Is negative 6. So negative 6 goes in our bracket. We square that, right? And what are we going to remain with? We shall remain with these two terms over here. We simplify them. That will be negative 36 plus 5. What will that give us? That simply gives us negative 31. There we go. We have what? Completed the square. And it is in what form? In this completed square form. The leading coefficient of 1. Yes? Okay, so now let us look at our last question. Yes? Now, with this question, as you can see, it has the leading coefficient of what? Of 2. Now remember, I did say that whenever we are completing the square, we have to make sure that we have the leading coefficient of 1. So in our case over here, we can factor out the leading coefficient. Yes, we can factor out the 2. Now, I would advise you guys factoring it out in these two terms over here. Okay, so let's do that. So let's factor out the 2. We take out the 2. We take out the 2. What are we going to remain with? We shall remain with x squared plus 2 into 8, that's 4, x plus 3. Yes, and what will be our next step? Our next step is what? Finding a number that we can add and subtract so we can create a perfect square trinomial while keeping the value of the expression, right? And how do we do that? By taking the half coefficient of x and then squaring it. Yes, taking the half coefficient of x and then square it. And then in our case, our coefficient of x is what? Is 4. So we're taking the half and then square it. 2 into 4 is 2. 2 by 2, that gives us what? That gives us 4. Right? Okay, so this is the number that we can add and subtract. So let's do that. Okay? So then we shall have 2. Sorry, let me just change my marker. Yes, 2 open bracket. Yes, x squared plus 4x. We're adding a 4. Subtracting a 4 plus 3. Yes? Okay, so now what will be our next step? We just have to simplify. If we look at this expression over here, it's a what? It's a perfect square trinomial, right? So we can write it into what? Squared binomial, right? So then we shall have 2, open our brackets, yes. What's the square root of x squared? X, yes. And then we have to find the constant here, and we know that we can what? We can find it by taking half of the what? X coefficient. So that's our 4 here, right? So we divide it by 2. We're taking the half. Yes, 2 into positive 4 is what? Is positive 4. Positive 4. And we square that. Minus 4. We close our brackets. Plus 3. What will be our next step? Our next step will be what? Distributing the 2 to all the terms in the brackets. That includes the negative 4. All right, so let's do that. We shall then have 2, yes, x plus 4 square. Yes, we square it. 2 multiplied by negative 8, that's negative 8 plus 3, right? Okay, now we can deal with these two terms here, right? And negative 8 plus 3, that's negative 5. So therefore, we shall then have 2 open brackets x plus 4, square it, minus 5. So there we go, we have completed the square of this quadratic expression over here. And our solution is in what? In this completed the square form here. Yes, because it has a leading coefficient of what? Of 2. All right. Thank you so much. I'll see you in my next lesson.